Welcome to English Story Hub. Learn English through fun stories. Improve vocabulary, listening, and speaking skills. Like, subscribe, and keep learning with us.
Hitler Studies. A Field of Amateurs. Part 1. Resumen. One of the greatest mysteries of the century must be the failure of professional historians and biographers, for more than half a century after the event, to show much interest in actually explaining it. The fact that Hitler continues to be a mystery, however, is not a fact like other facts, to be recorded as a datum of history and passed over. A mystery, by definition, is the appearance of something surprising or unexpected that fairly calls out for an explanation. But, is it not one of the purposes of history? Indeed, the major function of historians, to explain historical events and to make them understandable. Professional historians have consistently refused to get their hands dirty investigating the many mysteries of Hitler's life and career by going into the field to interview witnesses. Historians have not only failed, but have been charged by fellow historians with evading their duty to weave the facts of Hitler's life and career into a coherent and comprehensible narrative. Palabra clave. Biography, Germany, historians, historiography, Hitler, Nazism. If the career of Adolf Hitler is one of the most catastrophic events of the entire 20th century, including in its wake the most destructive war as well as the greatest crimes against humanity in human history, then one of the greatest mysteries of the century must be the failure of professional historians and biographers, for more than half a century after the event, to show much interest in actually explaining it. Imagine, for example, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, waiting until some time after the year 2060 before interviewing witnesses and commencing its investigation of Osama bin Laden to discover how he was able to plan and carry out the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon that occurred on 11 September 2001. Imagine further that in the intervening years all the work of interviewing witnesses and gathering the testimony, upon which subsequent investigators would have to rely if the whole story were ever to be told, was left to amateurs. Imagine next that FBI officials were loath to explain the event, insisting that it was the product of conditions, describing it in metaphors, and insisting on giving abstract causes for it that were devoid of concrete facts as well as inherently implausible. Finally, imagine that Osama bin Laden became a man of mystery and intense public fascination, his face, even in caricature, known by almost every school child on the planet. His birthday, like the birthday of Hitler, known by almost every high school student. The high and low points of his life, the subject of docudramas on prime-time television and countless popular books, articles, novels, plays, and movies. Imagine an entire academic industry grown up to insist on the mystery and inexplicability of the man. Impossible to imagine? Of course. But consider the attitude of professional historians to the case of Adolf Hitler, and the analogy may not seem as far-fetched as one might think. Indeed, I intend to argue that it is a fair analogy to describe the failure of historians to investigate the case of Adolf Hitler, the man behind the most catastrophic events of the 20th century. Of course, this would not be a fair analogy for most historical events. Historians are not the FBI, and they do not normally investigate current events, or even recent events. There are several reasons for this. The first and most important one is that rarely are the documents available until long after the event. In the case of major political leaders and events, governments often keep documents sealed for 50 years or longer. Thus, historians do not usually waste their time writing histories when they know that the most important information bearing on what happened is not available. Second, history is an ongoing process that tends to change. The understanding of events as they later develop and come to fruition. Often events that seemed unimportant at the time acquire greater significance with the passage of time. Decisions that seemed wise or foolish in the short run are sometimes seen to have been the height of folly or wisdom in the long run. Historians quite rightly do not wish to describe and explain events until they are fully played out. Thus, historians usually wait until many decades after an event to describe both its genesis and its consequences. In the case of Hitler, however, the analogy is pertinent because all of these preconditions were fulfilled by 1945 or, at the latest, by 1946. First, the eruption of Hitler and the Nazis came to a crushing end amid the ruins of the Third Reich. After the suicide of Hitler and the unconditional surrender of Germany, there was nothing more of Nazism to be developed or played out, except perhaps the trial of its leaders as war criminals and the judgment at Nuremberg, which was rendered by the end of 1946. After that, Nazism was as dead as a doornail and Hitler was nothing but history. Second, almost all of the documents and records of the Third Reich and the National Socialist Party were captured intact by the Allies, and, in a virtually unprecedented action, opened up to historians immediately after the war. Finally, the Nuremberg trials sealed the judgment of history on these events. There would be no reinterpretation. There were, therefore, no good reasons for historians not to begin writing a coherent biography of Hitler immediately after the war. In addition, there were several very strong reasons for historians to do so. First, public interest in and, indeed, fascination with the strange and mysterious career of Adolf Hitler and the bizarre events of the Third Reich has been high, not only in Germany but among the publics of the victorious Allies as well. Gordon A. Craig notes that as early as 1950, appalled by the flood of books and articles about National Socialism that was pouring from the printing presses, a German journalist wrote, "He has played a trick on us. This Hitler, I think he'll remain with us until the end of our lives." In the 1960s, a new wave of interest in Hitler appeared as the first generation born after World War II matured. In Germany, this was called the Hitlerwelle or Hitler wave. Normally a wave has a crest and a trough. However, as John Lukács observed 30 years later in 1997, the trough has not yet appeared, too. Indeed, the wave continues to grow. In 1975, it was reported that more than 50,000 serious books and scholarly articles had already been published, and bibliographers were complaining that their numbers were so high that it was becoming impossible to keep track of them. By 1995, it was reported that this number had increased by 70,000 to more than 120,000. To get some idea of the enormity of this research, that computes to more than 24 scholarly books and articles on Hitler and Nazism published every working day for 20 years, and the number is growing exponentially. Thus, public interest in the mystery of Hitler continues to grow, with no end in sight. Second, there were numerous witnesses available to be interviewed whose testimony would be vital to understanding solving the mystery. Historians were under a duty to track down these witnesses, interview them, and preserve their testimony before they died. Third, and most importantly, Adolf Hitler was, and is still, an unsolved mystery. Biographer Robert Payne calls the rise of Hitler most crucial and mystifying event of our century, while Eberhard Jäckel calls it the seminal question of the 20th century. Percy Ernst Sachram speaks for all historians when he writes, "By virtue of his personality, his ideas, and the fact that he misled millions, Hitler poses an historical problem of the first magnitude." H.R. Trevor Roper writes that, despite the passage of half a century, Hitler remains a frightening mystery. The fact that Hitler continues to be a mystery, however, is not a fact like other facts, to be recorded as a datum of history and passed over. A mystery, by definition, is the appearance of something surprising or unexpected that fairly calls out for an explanation. But, is it not one of the purposes of history, indeed, the major function of historians, to explain historical events and to make them understandable? Are historical problems of the first magnitude to be simply declared inexplicable? Is Hitler to live on as history's greatest mystery, the most unique and inexplicable man who ever lived? If the answer to these questions is no, then we must inquire into the responsibility of historians as to why the mystery remains. In light of these questions, what are the duties of professional historians? Theodor Mommsen long ago set out criteria for what is minimally expected of historians. History, he said, is nothing but the distinct knowledge of actual happenings, consisting on the one hand of the discovery and examination of the available testimony, and on the other of the weaving of this testimony into a narrative in accordance with one's understanding of the men who shaped the events and the conditions that prevailed. Thus historians have two minimal duties: 1. To discover and examine the available testimony, and 2. To weave it into a coherent narrative. In regard to the rise of Hitler, historians have failed this definition on both counts. On the first count, professional historians have consistently refused to get their hands dirty investigating the many mysteries of Hitler's life and career by going into the field to interview witnesses. were it not for a handful of amateurs who ventured to go where the angels of the historical profession feared to tread, we would not have many of the materials upon which historians are now relying to solve the mystery. On the second count, historians have not only failed, but have been charged by fellow historians with evading their duty to weave the facts of Hitler's life and career into a coherent and comprehensible narrative. Instead, Hitler remains an unexplained mystery, an unperson. Unique in all human history, declared to be inexplicable. The reason for the vast and rising public and scholarly interest in Hitler, I submit, is simple. He continues to be a mystery. The attraction involved in such a mystery was once described by Albert Einstein, who said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is a mystery." Hitler become beautiful? This is a terrifying thought. But the fact is that the most horrible things, from Frankenstein to Dracula to Godzilla to the slime monster, can become fascinating and attractive when wrapped in mystery. Peter Weiden has written of the increasing public fascination with Hitler as the Hitler virus. The danger, as Saul Friedlander warns, is that such continued fascination may result in an inversion of science and the beginning of a new discourse about evil. It is the purpose of this article to discuss the responsibility of historians for the continuing mystery of Hitler and the corresponding fascination it attracts, in terms of the two duties that Mommsen laid upon them. 1. The duty to investigate and gather the facts necessary to solve the mystery, and 2. The duty to weave the facts into a coherent narrative. 1. The failure of historians to investigate. The most fundamental and difficult question in the field of Hitler studies is the question of how this uneducated high school dropout and bum from the streets of Vienna ever came to be one of the most outstanding orators and political organizers in German, if not all modern history. Strangely, the professional historians have avoided this question as though it were a case of AIDS. Surely, unless there was some miracle in Hitler's life at the age of 30 when he attended his first political meeting 10, any historian worth his salt would be looking into this man's early life to find the secret of his success at gaining power. Yet, instead of going into the field to find and interview every person who ever knew the young Hitler, as any good private detective would have done, the professional historians sat at their desks for 50 years, leaving all of the tracking down and interviewing of witnesses to amateur historians. Fortunately, there were several amateurs who stepped in to fill the gap, and it is to them that we owe most of everything that we know of the young Hitler, other than what this most secretive of men chose to tell. The first of these was Franz Jetzinger, author Hitler's Jugend, Fantasien, Lügen und die Wahrheit, 1956-11. Jetzinger was not a historian but a Social Democratic Assembly of Upper Austria for 15 years before the Second World War. After the war, he secured a post as librarian of the provincial archives in Liege. Jetzinger hated Hitler with a passion, and in 1946 began searching for every document and interviewing every witness he could locate in connection with Hitler's youth. It is to Jetzinger that we owe much of our knowledge of the documents of Hitler's family, his ancestors, his father's change of name, and where the family lived. Jetzinger's interviews of those who had known Hitler and his family have also proved invaluable, perhaps the most important of which was his discovery of Hitler's only childhood friend, August Kubizek, whom Jetzinger located, interviewed, and goaded into writing a much longer set of his own memoirs. The latter were published in 1953 as Adolf Hitler, med Jugendfreund 12, and constitute the only testimony we have from anyone who knew Hitler as a youth. Kubizek's memoirs are important as the first and only insight into, as H.R. Trevor Roper writes in the introduction to Kubizek's memoirs, the incipient character of the man who, without any other natural advantage besides his own personality, became the most powerful and terrible tyrant and conqueror of modern history. It was only through the indefatigable work of Jetzinger, however, that this witness was discovered and his testimony obtained before he died. If it had been left to the professional historians, we would never have known of Kubizek, and his memoirs might never have been written and published. The next amateur to do what professional historians ought to have done was Werner Maser. Maser was a simple soldier during the war who spent time in both American and Russian prisoner of war camps and, upon his release, studied in East Berlin. Emigrating to the West in 1952, he worked first as a journalist before realizing that the investigation of Hitler was being completely ignored by the professional historians. He set out to fill the vacuum. Maser's main achievement, writes John Lukács, was the unearthing of large quantities of data through his tireless research. Much of this data came from Maser's relentless efforts to track down the testimony of witnesses who knew Hitler, and his determination to collect and preserve their testimony before they died. Between 1965 and 1973, he produced 4 huge volumes on the history of the National Socialist Party and Hitler's early career, followed by a book on Mein Kampfer, a biography of Hitler, and a book on Hitler's papers and documents. Though Maser was clearly carrying out the first duty of a historian according to Theodor Mommsen, his work was not appreciated by professional historians. Rather, as Lukács notes, he was excluded from the higher circle of German academic historians. One is reminded of the attitude of professional police forces toward private detectives in mystery novels. Their results in solving cases are grudgingly recognized, but the detectives themselves are looked down upon. To give some idea of the importance of both Jetzinger and Maser, it is worth noting how much their work is relied upon by professionals. In Ian Kershaw's recent biography, Hitler, Hubris 1889–1936, for example, 90 of the 164 footnotes to the chapter on Hitler's youth, Chapter 1, cite Jetzinger, Maser, or Kubizek, and almost all of these are for factual information, while of the remaining 74 footnotes, 27 cite to Hitler himself, or are largely interpretational. Thus, almost everything we know of the facts of Hitler's early life, except what Hitler himself chooses to tell us, comes from these amateurs who did the primary research and gathered the testimony while the witnesses were alive. John Toland, author of Adolf Hitler, New York, Doubleday, 1976, is the next amateur to begin doing what the professionals should have done. Toland began researching his biography of Hitler in the 1960s by visiting every place Hitler had ever lived and talking to people who knew him. Toland located over 250 witnesses and was amazed to find that many of them had never been interviewed by a professional historian. Perhaps the most damning evidence of the failure of professional historians to do primary research, however, is Brigitta Hamann, author of Hitler's Wien. Lehrjahre eines Diktators, 1996. Hamann is a historian of the 19th century who left her normal field because of the glaring failure of historians to check their sources. She was the first scholar to evaluate the mass of conflicting testimonies from the Vienna period of Hitler's life. During the 1930s and later, many highly questionable sources came forward with exposés about Hitler containing much sensational and contradictory information. Professional historians were in the habit of uncritically roaming through these materials to quote whatever random piece of information fit their theory. Until Hamann, it rarely occurred to professional historians to actually study the materials, evaluate their credibility, to correct inaccuracies, or resolve contradictions.